The dried meat looked gray and tough, but Nadia's mouth watered anyway. 3 copper coins sat in her palm, the last of everything she owned, and the merchant's eyes kept sliding to her swollen belly with the kind of disgust that made her wolf bristle beneath her skin. 4 coppers, the merchant said, not bothering to hide his sneer. Final price. I have 3. She hated how her voice cracked, hated more how her hand trembled when she held out the coins. 7 months pregnant, 3 weeks running, and her body had begun to betray her in ways she couldn't hide. The hollows beneath her cheekbones, the way her dress hung loose everywhere except her belly, the fine tremor in her fingers that wouldn't stop no matter how much she willed it. The merchant shrugged. Then you don't eat. Please, she wanted to say. I'm carrying a child. I need something. Anything. But begging had gotten her nothing in Thornhaven except pitying looks and slammed doors. The wolves here could smell the desperation on her, could scent the wrongness of a pregnant female alone without pack, without mate, without protection. In the hierarchy of their kind, she had become something worse than Omega. She had become nothing at all. Nadia closed her fist around the coins and turned away, her wolf whimpering inside her chest. 3 weeks. 21 days since Wulfric had stood before their pack and declared her a traitor. 21 days since her mother had refused to meet her eyes while the accusations poured out like poison: half-breed bastard, conspiracy with enemies, betrayal of blood and bond. None of it true. All of it believed. She remembered the exact moment her brother's face had shifted from the cold mask he'd worn for the public accusations to something far worse, something satisfied, something hungry, when the elders had pronounced her exile. He'd leaned close as the guards dragged her toward the border, his breath hot against her ear. You should have died with father, he'd whispered, would have saved me the trouble. The memory made her stumble and she caught herself against a wooden post, breathing hard. Her baby shifted inside her, a flutter of movement that grounded her when nothing else could. She pressed her palm flat against the swell of her belly and closed her eyes. I'm sorry, she murmured, so quiet no one else could hear. I'm so sorry. I'm trying. But trying wasn't enough. The winter storms would arrive within the week. She could smell the change in the air, feel the dropping pressure in her bones. And she had no shelter, no food, no way to keep them both alive when the snows came. The borderlands were supposed to be neutral territory. Wolves from all packs passed through Thornhaven on their way to other places, and she'd hoped, foolishly, that she might find work here. A healer's skills should have value. But the moment anyone learned she was Ravencrest, cast out, disgraced, pregnant with what her brother had convinced them all was an enemy's child, doors closed. Opportunities vanished. The few coins she'd managed to bring had stretched 3 weeks only because she'd eaten almost nothing, and now even that was gone. Nadia forced herself upright and began walking again, though she had nowhere to go. The market square bustled around her, wolves and humans alike conducting their business, and she felt like a ghost drifting through their world, invisible, inconsequential. Her wolf pressed against her ribs, restless in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. Something's coming, the animal part of her seemed to say. Something's... A wave of heat crashed through her so suddenly that she gasped and grabbed the nearest solid object, which happened to be a merchant's counter selling preserved meats. Her wolf surged against her skin, howling with a ferocity that nearly drove her to her knees. Mine. Mine. Him. Nadia's breath came in short, sharp bursts. Her skin prickled with awareness she couldn't explain, every nerve ending suddenly alive, suddenly reaching toward... The massive figure stepped up beside her, and the world narrowed to a single point. He was broad-shouldered and scarred, dressed in traveling clothes that should have made him unremarkable, but somehow made him more. Dark hair fell across his forehead. a jaw sharp enough to cut. And his eyes were shifting, gold bleeding into the dark irises like sunrise burning through storm clouds. A low growl rumbled from his chest, deep enough that she felt it vibrate through the wooden counter between them. His hands fisted at his sides, knuckles going white, as if he was fighting with every ounce of his considerable strength not to reach for her. Nadia couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare as recognition crashed through her like a wave she'd never seen coming. Mate. The word rang through her with devastating clarity. Her wolf had chosen, was still choosing, howling him. Him, with absolute certainty while Nadia's rational mind screamed in protest. She didn't know his name, didn't know his face, didn't know anything about him except that he was looking at her like she was the first sunrise after an endless winter night, and the longing that look sparked in her chest terrified her more than anything Wulfric had ever done. You. His voice was rough, scraped raw by whatever was happening behind his golden eyes. Who are you? She should answer, should speak, should do something other than stand here trembling while her wolf tried to claw its way out of her chest and throw itself at his feet. I. The word came out as barely a whisper. I'm no one. The growl that ripped from his throat made the merchant scramble backward. Made the wolves at nearby stalls freeze and lower their eyes. Made Nadia's knees actually buckle this time, though she caught herself on the counter before she could fall. You are not no one. He took a step toward her, and she should have run. Everything she'd learned about survival in the last 3 weeks screamed at her to run, but her feet wouldn't move. Her wolf wouldn't let them. You're... He stopped, inhaled sharply, and his eyes dropped to her belly. The gold in his irises flickered. Nadia watched the realization cross his face. Pregnant, alone, starving, his mate, and waited for the disgust, the rejection. The same cold dismissal she'd seen in every other wolf's eyes since her exile. Instead, something raw and aching moved through his expression. How long since you've eaten? The question hit her like a physical blow. Not whose child is that or what did you do to be cast out, or any of the other accusations she'd braced herself for. Just concern. Genuine, devastating concern for a stranger who had no claim on him, but the bond neither of them had asked for. Her vision blurred. She blinked furiously, refusing to cry, refusing to show that weakness in the middle of a crowded market. I don't... Her throat closed around the words. It doesn't matter. I can manage. You're shaking. He took another step closer, and his scent washed over her. Pine and musk and something deeper, something her wolf recognized in its bones. You can barely stand. And you're trying to tell me you can manage? I've managed this long. How long? She didn't answer. Couldn't answer. The honest response would have broken something in her that she was desperately trying to hold together. But he seemed to read it in her face anyway, because the gold in his eyes blazed brighter and the growl that rumbled from his chest was pure protective fury. Come with me. It wasn't a command, not quite, but it wasn't a request either. Somewhere in between, leaving her room to refuse while making it absolutely clear he hoped she wouldn't. Everything she'd learned about surviving alone screamed that this was dangerous, that trusting a stranger, even a mate, would only lead to more pain. That the bond pounding between them like a second heartbeat couldn't be trusted because bonds could be broken and mates could betray, and the child in her belly was the only thing that mattered. But her wolf was howling yes, and her body was swaying toward him like a flower seeking sun, and she was so tired, so desperately, bone-achingly tired. Why? The words scraped out of her throat. You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. His jaw tightened. For a long moment he just looked at her, at the hollows in her cheeks, and the tremor in her hands and the defiant set of her chin despite everything. My wolf knows you, he said finally, quietly, like a confession he hadn't meant to make. And that's enough. For now. Nadia's breath shuddered out of her. Somewhere in the back of her mind, the part that still remembered being Ravencrest's healer, being loved and trusted and home, that part whispered, maybe not all bonds are meant to break. She was probably making a terrible mistake. She'd made so many already. But when he turned and walked toward the edge of the market square, she found herself following. Nadia followed him through the winding streets of Thornhaven, her wolf pressing forward with each step, urging her closer to the broad expanse of his back. The cobblestones were slick with the afternoon's earlier rain, and twice she stumbled, her body betraying the exhaustion she'd been fighting for weeks. Both times, he turned, not reaching for her, not touching, but waiting with a patience that made something ache behind her ribs. He hadn't told her his name. She hadn't offered hers. And yet, her wolf knew him, knew the cadence of his footsteps, the particular way his shoulders moved beneath his traveling cloak, the scent of him that wrapped around her senses like a promise she was terrified to believe. Mate, her wolf insisted, the word reverberating through her with bone-deep certainty. Ours. His. Stop, Nadia told the animal part of herself. We don't know him. We can't trust. But her wolf wasn't listening. Hadn't been listening since the moment heat had flooded her veins in the market square, since his eyes had shifted gold and locked with hers, and something inside her had recognized something inside him. The mate bond. She'd heard stories, of course. Every wolf pup grew up on tales of the sacred connection, the instant recognition, the pull so powerful it could reshape entire lives. She'd even witnessed it once. Two wolves in her former pack finding each other during a harvest festival, the way they'd gravitated together like celestial bodies falling into orbit. She'd never expected it to happen to her. Certainly not like this. Not when she was starving and pregnant and cast out from everything she'd ever known. Not when accepting any bond felt like inviting more pain into a life that had already shattered beyond repair. The stranger stopped before a modest inn at the edge of the merchant district. Nadia recognized it vaguely. The Stone's Rest, she thought it was called. One of the few establishments in Thornhaven that didn't cater exclusively to any particular pack. Neutral ground. Safe ground, as much as anywhere could be safe for her now. He turned to face her, and the gold had faded from his eyes, leaving them dark and unreadable. But the tension in his jaw remained, and his hands were still fisted at his sides, as if touching her was a temptation he was actively fighting. You need food, he said, and rest, and... His gaze dropped to her belly again, and something flickered across his face. Pain, maybe? Or wonder? She couldn't tell. And proper care. I told you, I can manage. You're 7 months pregnant and you haven't eaten in days. The words came out rougher than before, edged with that growl she'd heard in the market. Don't tell me you can manage. Don't lie to me. Whatever else happens between us, don't lie. Nadia's throat tightened. The exhaustion she'd been holding at bay crashed over her, and suddenly she was blinking back tears she refused to let fall. She was so tired of being strong, so tired of pretending she wasn't falling apart one breath at a time. 3 days, she admitted, her voice barely audible. I had some stale bread 3 days ago. Before that, she shook her head. I lost track. The sound that escaped him wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite a snarl. Something between the two. Something that spoke of fury held barely in check. Come inside. This time, she didn't argue. The inn's common room was warm and smelled of wood smoke and roasting meat, and Nadia had to grip the doorframe to keep from swaying as her body registered what it had been denied for so long. Her stomach cramped painfully, and she pressed her hand against her belly, feeling her baby shift in response to her distress. The stranger, her mate, the word she still couldn't quite accept, spoke briefly with the innkeeper, exchanging coins that clinked with the weight of silver rather than copper. Nadia watched him from beneath her lashes, cataloging details her wolf absorbed hungrily. The scars on his hands, pale lines that suggested old battles and older pain. The way he held himself, confident without arrogance, commanding without cruelty. The deference the innkeeper showed him. Not fear, exactly, but respect. The kind earned rather than demanded. Who was he? What was he? She didn't ask. Wasn't sure she wanted to know. If he was someone powerful, someone important, that only made her more dangerous to him. The accusations Wulfric had leveled against her were lies, but they had spread through the borderlands like wildfire. Being seen with the Ravencrest traitor could damage him, could destroy him, depending on who he was. She should leave, should slip away before anyone connected them, before her presence became a poison in his life, the way it had poisoned everything else. But her wolf howled in protest at the very thought, and her legs wouldn't move. And then he was turning back to her with a key in his hand and something that might have been concern softening the hard lines of his face. Rooms at the top of the stairs. I'll have food sent up. Nadia stared at him. You're not coming? Something shifted in his expression. A muscle ticked in his jaw, and for a moment the gold flickered back into his eyes. I'm not going to force myself into your space. The words came out measured, careful, like he was choosing each one with deliberate precision. You don't know me. You have no reason to trust me. And you... He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had roughened. You deserve to feel safe, even if it's just for one night. The tears she'd been fighting spilled over. She couldn't stop them this time. Couldn't maintain the walls she'd built around herself since the exile, because no one had worried about whether she felt safe. Not once in 3 weeks of running and hiding and surviving by sheer desperate will. Why? The question tore out of her, raw and aching. Why would you... We just met. The bond doesn't mean... It doesn't mean you owe me kindness. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached out. Not touching her, just offering his hand, palm up, like she was a wounded animal he was trying not to spook. The bond doesn't owe you anything, he agreed. But I'm not doing this because of the bond. I'm doing this because you're exhausted and pregnant and someone should have taken care of you weeks ago, and... He stopped. Something fierce and almost helpless moving through his eyes. And my wolf will tear this town apart if I don't at least try to help you. Nadia stared at his offered hand. The scars. The calluses. The steadiness that spoke of strength enough to hold and gentleness enough to choose not to. She didn't take it. Couldn't quite make herself cross that bridge yet, but she nodded once, and when she climbed the stairs to the room he'd paid for, she felt his eyes on her back the entire way. The room was small, but clean, with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over Thornhaven's sloping rooftops. Nadia sank onto the mattress and pressed both hands against her belly, feeling her baby move in response to the sudden stillness after so much walking. It's okay, she murmured, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to her child or herself. We're okay. For now. A knock at the door made her tense, but when she opened it, she found only a tray sitting on the floor. Bread and cheese and a thick stew still steaming in its bowl, with a small pot of honey and a cup of warm milk beside it. No one in the hallway. No one demanding entry or payment or explanation. Just food. Just care. Just kindness she hadn't earned and couldn't explain. Nadia ate slowly, savoring every bite, forcing herself not to devour everything at once despite her stomach's desperate demands. The baby settled as her body finally received nourishment, and by the time she'd finished half the stew and most of the bread, her eyelids were dragging with exhaustion. She should stay awake, should keep watch, should maintain the vigilance that had kept her alive for 21 days of running. But the bed was soft, and her belly was full for the first time in weeks, and her wolf had gone quiet with a contentment she didn't understand. Safe, the animal part of her seemed to say. He's near. We're safe. Nadia fell asleep, still trying to convince herself that safety was an illusion she couldn't afford to believe in. She woke to gray morning light and the sound of quiet breathing outside her door. For a moment she lay frozen, her heart hammering, every instinct screaming danger. But then she caught his scent. Pine and musk and that deeper note her wolf recognized, and something in her chest loosened despite her fear. Slowly, silently, she crept to the door and opened it a crack. He was sitting against the wall of the hallway, his head tipped back, his eyes closed. Not asleep, she could tell. His breathing was too controlled, too aware, but still, present, waiting. He'd slept outside her door all night, guarding her, protecting her, giving her the space she needed while making absolutely certain nothing could reach her in the darkness. Her wolf keened softly, pressing forward with a longing that made Nadia's chest ache. She wanted to go to him, wanted to curl against his chest and let him hold her and believe, even for a moment, that she didn't have to face everything alone. But she'd believed that before, had trusted that her pack would protect her, that her brother loved her, that home was something permanent rather than something that could be ripped away without warning. She closed the door quietly and leaned her forehead against the wood, breathing past the tightness in her throat. One night, she told herself, you can accept one night of kindness without it meaning anything, without letting him in. But her wolf was already calling him ours, and the bond between them hummed with a warmth she couldn't ignore, and Nadia was beginning to suspect that keeping him out wasn't going to be as simple as she'd hoped. They traveled together the next day, heading north along the mountain road. She still hadn't asked where they were going, he still hadn't offered his name. But he walked beside her rather than ahead, matching his stride to hers, and every time the path grew rough or steep, his hand would hover near her elbow, not touching, never touching without permission, but ready. By midday, they'd stopped at a small roadside shelter when 3 wolves emerged from the tree line. Pack wolves, from the smell of them. Local territory. They looked at the stranger with wary respect, and at Nadia with undisguised contempt. You're traveling heavy, the largest of them said, his lip curling as his gaze raked over her swollen belly. What pack does she belong to? Mine. The single word hit like a physical force. Nadia felt it reverberate through her bones, and the 3 wolves actually stumbled back a step, their eyes widening as they registered something in the stranger's voice that Nadia couldn't quite name. We didn't mean, one of them started. You looked at her like she was nothing. His voice had dropped to something cold and terrible. Like she was beneath you, like her worth was yours to judge. She's Ravencrest. The largest wolf recovered enough to speak, though his voice had gone thin. The exile. The traitor. Everyone's heard. A snarl ripped through the clearing, so savage that Nadia felt her knees weaken with instinctive fear. But the stranger's fury wasn't directed at her. It was directed at the wolves who were now backing away, their own wolves showing in their widened eyes, their submitted postures. I don't care what you've heard. He stepped forward, and Nadia saw his muscles coil beneath his clothing, saw the predator lurking beneath the controlled surface. She is under my protection. Anyone who looks at her with disrespect again will answer to me. The wolves fled. Nadia stood frozen, her heart pounding, her wolf practically vibrating with something that felt disturbingly like pride. He turned to face her, and the fury drained from his expression so quickly it left her dizzy. In its place was something almost like embarrassment. I shouldn't have... He stopped, ran a hand through his dark hair. I'm sorry. That was... I didn't mean to frighten you. You didn't. The words escaped before she could stop them. I mean, not... She struggled to articulate what she was feeling. This strange tangle of surprise and confusion, and something warm unfurling in her chest. No one's defended me. Not since. She couldn't finish. Couldn't explain that even before the exile, her brother had spent years making her feel small, making her question her worth, making her believe that she was tolerated rather than valued. The stranger's expression shifted. Something understanding moved through his eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle in a way that made her want to weep. Then everyone you knew before was a fool. Nadia's breath caught. She stared at him. This man she didn't know, this mate she hadn't chosen, this stranger who kept showing her kindness she'd forgotten how to accept. "I don't even know your name," she whispered. "Brennan." Just the one word. No pack name, no titles, no explanation of who he was or why wolves showed him such deference. Just his name, offered like a gift. "Nadia," she said, and something shifted between them. Something settled, like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known existed. His eyes warmed, gold flickering briefly at the edges. Nadia. The way he said her name made her wolf stretch toward him, made the bond between them hum with a frequency she could almost hear. She should have been afraid, should have been guarding herself against the pain that would inevitably come. But when he offered his hand again, palm up, patient, waiting for her to choose, she found herself reaching back. Their fingers touched, and warmth flooded through her so suddenly she gasped. Not electricity, not fire, but something softer, something that felt like coming home after a journey she hadn't known she was taking. "Whatever happened to you?" Brennan said quietly, his thumb tracing a gentle circle against her palm. "Whatever they said you did, I don't believe it. And whatever comes next, you don't have to face it alone." Nadia closed her eyes against the burn of tears. She didn't trust him. Not yet. Not fully. She couldn't afford to trust anyone after everything that had happened. But for the first time in 21 days, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, trust could be earned. And something deep inside her, something that had been frozen since her brother's whispered words at the border, began slowly, painfully, to thaw. The mountain road stretched northward through pines that grew thicker with each mile, their branches heavy with early snow. Nadia walked beside Brennan in a silence that should have felt uncomfortable but somehow didn't, her hand still tingling from where his fingers had touched hers. The warmth of that contact lingered like an ember buried in ash, and her wolf, usually so restless, so desperate, had settled into something almost like contentment. She didn't trust it, didn't trust him, not fully, no matter how her instincts screamed otherwise. But she kept walking, kept putting one foot in front of the other as the path climbed higher and the air grew thin and cold. Her back ached with the weight of her belly, and her legs trembled with exhaustion she'd been ignoring for 3 weeks. But she refused to slow down, refused to show weakness in front of this stranger who looked at her like she mattered. "There's a village ahead," Brennan said, breaking the silence. His voice was rough, almost hesitant, as if he wasn't used to making conversation. "We can rest there for the night, get you proper food." Nadia's stomach clenched at the mention of food. She'd eaten that morning, the bread and dried meat he'd left outside her door at the inn, but her body still felt hollow, still ached with the memory of hunger that 3 weeks of starvation couldn't erase. "I can keep walking," she said, and hated how thin her voice sounded. Brennan stopped, turned to face her with an expression she couldn't read. "I know you can. But you don't have to prove anything to me, Nadia." The way he said her name made something flutter in her chest. She looked away, focusing on the snow-dusted path, on the way her breath misted in the cold air. "I'm not trying to prove anything," she said. "I'm just trying to survive, trying not to need anyone, trying to protect the child growing inside me from a world that's already shown me how cruel it can be." She didn't say any of it. Couldn't find the words to explain the terror that lived in her chest, the constant calculation of threat and escape that had become her only way of thinking. Brennan studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded, something like understanding moving through his dark eyes. The village is an hour's walk. There's an inn run by a woman who owes me a favor. She'll give us rooms, no questions asked. Why? The word escaped before Nadia could stop it. Why are you doing this? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. And I'm... She gestured at herself, at her ragged dress and swollen belly and the shadows she knew lived under her eyes. I'm no one's idea of a prize, Brennan. Whatever your wolf thinks it wants. My wolf knows exactly what it wants. His voice dropped, something rough and possessive threading through the words. And so do I. Heat flooded Nadia's cheeks. She opened her mouth to respond, to argue, to push back, to build the walls she'd been trying to construct since the moment she felt the bond snap into place. But no words came. Brennan's expression softened. I'm not asking for anything, Nadia. Not now. Not until you're ready. He paused, running a hand through his dark hair in that gesture she was beginning to recognize. I want you safe. That's all. Everything else can wait. The village appeared as the sun began to sink toward the mountain peaks, casting long shadows across the snow. It was small, a cluster of timber buildings arranged around a central square, smoke rising from chimneys, the scent of cooking meat drifting on the cold air. Nadia's stomach growled audibly, and she pressed a hand against her belly in embarrassment. Brennan's mouth quirked. Not quite a smile, but close. Come on, let's get you fed. The inn was warm and surprisingly welcoming, its common room filled with the soft murmur of conversation and the crackle of a massive stone fireplace. The innkeeper, a gray-haired woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner, took one look at Brennan and straightened, something like wary respect flickering across her weathered features. Back so soon? She asked, and there was a question beneath the question that Nadia couldn't quite parse. I need 2 rooms, Brennan said. And food. Whatever you have that's hot. The woman's gaze slid to Nadia, taking in her condition with a practiced eye. Whatever she saw made her expression soften almost imperceptibly. I'll have food brought up, she said, and hot water for a bath. You look like you could use it, child. Nadia bristled at the word, but the promise of hot water and clean clothes was too tempting to refuse. She nodded, and the woman bustled away, leaving her alone with Brennan in the crowded common room. I'll be right next door, he said quietly. If you need anything. I know. She hesitated, then forced herself to meet his eyes. Thank you. For all of this. Something warm flickered in his gaze. You don't have to thank me, Nadia. Yes, she said softly. I do. The bath was heaven. Nadia sank into the steaming water and felt weeks of fear and exhaustion begin to loosen their grip on her muscles. The baby kicked, a strong, healthy kick that made her laugh despite everything, and she pressed her palm against the spot where tiny feet pushed against her skin. We're going to be okay, she whispered. I don't know how, but we're going to be okay. She was just drying her hair when the knock came. Soft, hesitant. Nothing like Brennan's confident rap against her door at the previous inn. Nadia pulled the borrowed robe tighter around herself and moved toward the door, instincts prickling with sudden unease. Who is it? An old friend. Little sister. The world stopped. Nadia's hand froze on the door handle, her blood turning to ice in her veins. That voice. She knew that voice better than her own heartbeat. Knew it from childhood lullabies and whispered cruelties, from the day he'd stood before their pack and called her a traitor, from the moment at the border when he'd leaned close and hissed, "You should have died with father." Wulfric, her brother, was here. Open the door, Nadia. His tone was pleasant, almost gentle, and that terrified her more than any threat could have. We have so much to discuss. Her legs wouldn't move. Her lungs wouldn't fill. She stood frozen as the door handle began to turn. He must have gotten a key from the innkeeper, must have charmed or threatened his way past, and then he was there, standing in the doorway of her room, tall and golden-haired and beautiful in that cold, predatory way that had always made other wolves follow him. There you are. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click. I've been looking everywhere for you. How? Her voice cracked. She forced herself to speak through the terror clawing at her throat. How did you find me? Wulfric smiled. It was the same smile he'd worn when they were children, when he'd break her toys and tell their mother she'd done it herself. The same smile he'd worn in the Great Hall when he'd accused her of treason. Did you really think you could run from me, little sister? After everything you did? He moved closer, and Nadia backed away until her spine hit the wall. The accusations may have been enough to exile you from Ravencrest, but they weren't enough to give me what I really wanted. I need the child, Nadia. The Ravencrest heirs are running thin, and your bastard, whatever its true parentage, carries our bloodline. You know the accusations were lies. The words tore out of her, raw and desperate. You planted the evidence. You convinced them I was a traitor. Our own mother. Our mother saw what I needed her to see. Wulfric's eyes gleamed with something like pride. She's always been easy to manipulate, so desperate for approval, so terrified of losing status. All I had to do was whisper, and she turned away. Nadia's knees threatened to buckle. She'd known, somewhere deep down, that Wulfric had orchestrated her downfall. But hearing him admit it so casually, with such obvious pleasure. What do you want? She whispered. I told you. The child. He reached out, and his fingers brushed against her belly before she could jerk away. You're going to come back to Ravencrest with me. You're going to give birth under my supervision. And then, you're going to disappear, and I'm going to raise your offspring as my own heir. No. The word came out stronger than she expected. I won't let you. You don't have a choice. Wulfric's pleasant mask slipped, revealing the cold cruelty beneath. You're a disgraced exile, 7 months pregnant with no pack, no protection, and no hope. Who's going to stop me? I am. The voice came from the doorway, and Nadia's heart stuttered. Brennan stood there, and he was no longer the gentle stranger who'd bought her food and slept outside her door. The wolf had risen to the surface, golden light bleeding into his dark eyes, his entire body coiled with barely contained violence. He looked at Wulfric the way a predator looked at prey, and something in Nadia's chest expanded with an emotion she was afraid to name. Ah! Wulfric turned, and his smile never wavered. The mysterious protector. I wondered who'd been escorting my sister through the borderlands. His eyes narrowed, assessing. You're not from any pack I recognize. Who are you? Someone who's going to rip out your throat if you don't step away from her right now. The threat hung in the air, deadly and absolute. Nadia saw Wulfric's composure flicker, just for a moment, before he smoothed his expression back into that familiar mask of charm. I see. He straightened, adjusting his cloak with deliberate casualness. Well, this is an unexpected complication. He looked at Nadia, and something ugly moved in his eyes. We'll continue this conversation later, little sister, when you don't have your guard dog nearby. He moved toward the door, and Brennan stepped aside just enough to let him pass. But as Wulfric crossed the threshold, he paused and looked back. A word of advice, he said softly. Be careful who you trust, Nadia. The people who seem like saviors are often the most dangerous of all. Then he was gone, footsteps fading down the hallway, and Nadia's legs finally gave out. Brennan caught her before she hit the floor. His arms wrapped around her, strong and warm and impossibly gentle, and she found herself clinging to him with desperate fingers. He found me, She gasped. He's here. He's been following me. He wants. I know. Brennan's voice was rough, his chest vibrating against her cheek. I heard everything. The door was thin. He's going to take my baby. He planned everything, Brennan, the accusations, the exile, all of it. He's not going to touch you. The words were fierce, absolute, a vow spoken against her hair as he held her close. Either of you, I swear it. Nadia pulled back enough to look at his face. His jaw was tight, his eyes still burning with that golden light, and she realized with sudden clarity that she didn't know who this man was. Didn't know why wolves showed him such deference, why her brother had recognized the threat he posed, why someone as powerful as Brennan seemed to be would spend his time protecting a pregnant exile he'd only just met. "Who are you?" she whispered. Something flickered in his expression. Pain, maybe, or fear. "Someone who's going to keep you safe," he said, "no matter what." It wasn't an answer, but the way he looked at her, like she was precious, like she mattered, like he would burn down the world to protect her, made her wolf settle deeper into the bond between them, made her heart crack open just a little more despite all her walls. That night, Brennan didn't leave her alone. He sat in the chair by the fire, watchful and alert, while Nadia curled in the bed with her hand pressed against her belly. She should have felt awkward, should have felt vulnerable and exposed. Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 21 days of running. She felt safe. "Tell me about your father," she said softly, watching the firelight play across his features. "Wulfric said I should have died with him. I still don't know what he meant." Brennan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "What happened to him?" "He was killed." Nadia closed her eyes against the memory. "A border dispute with a neighboring pack. He went to negotiate peace, and they—" She swallowed. "They sent his body back in pieces. I'm sorry. Wulfric blamed me." The words came slowly, dragged from somewhere deep. "I was the healer. I was supposed to sense danger, supposed to know when someone meant harm. But I was young, and my abilities weren't fully developed, and I couldn't—" Her voice broke. "I couldn't save him." "That wasn't your fault." "I know." She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "I know that now. But Wulfric never forgave me. He said a real healer would have known, would have felt the threat before it arrived. He said I might as well have wielded the blade myself." Brennan's hands fisted on the arms of his chair. "Your brother is a monster." "Yes." The admission cost her nothing. "He is." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Then Brennan spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I understand monsters, Nadia. I've faced them before, and I swear to you, this one won't win." She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust in the certainty she heard in his voice, in the strength she felt radiating from his presence. But Wulfric had spent years manipulating everyone around him, had turned their mother against her, had convinced an entire pack she was a traitor. What chance did one man have against that kind of cruelty? And yet, when Brennan reached across the space between them and took her hand, his palm warm and calloused against her fingers, Nadia felt something stir in her chest. Not her wolf, not the bond, something deeper, something that felt like hope. "I don't know how to trust anyone anymore," she admitted quietly. "Then let me earn it." His thumb traced a gentle circle against her palm, echoing the gesture from the mountain road. "One day at a time." Nadia looked at their joined hands, at the scars on his knuckles, at the way his grip was firm without being possessive, protective without being controlling. And for the first time since her world had shattered, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, the future held something other than fear. The weeks that followed blurred together in a rhythm Nadia hadn't expected. travel northward through mountain passes that grew steeper and colder, nights spent in inns where Brennan's name commanded respect she didn't understand, and slow conversations that peeled back the layers of who they were beneath the bond that hummed between them. She learned that he preferred his tea bitter, that he woke before dawn and stood at windows watching the horizon as if expecting threats to materialize from the mist. She learned that his scars came from battles he wouldn't name, that his wolf was ancient and powerful in ways that made other wolves lower their eyes, and she learned, gradually, that the deference shown to him wasn't merely respect, it was something closer to reverence. But he still hadn't told her who he was, and she hadn't pressed, because the fragile trust building between them felt too precious to risk with questions he clearly wasn't ready to answer. They arrived at his territory on the first day of the Winter Summit, when the 5 great packs gathered to renew alliances and settle disputes. The fortress rose from the mountainside like it had grown from the stone itself, massive and ancient, its walls carved with symbols Nadia recognized from the oldest healer's texts, the marks of the High King's bloodline. Her feet stopped moving. "Brennan." Her voice came out strange, thin. "Where are we?" He turned to look at her, and something in his expression shifted. Guilt, maybe, or fear of her reaction. "Home," he said quietly. "My home." "This is the King's fortress." Nadia's heart pounded against her ribs. "The High King of the 5 packs. You brought me to—" "I am the High King." The words landed like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything she thought she knew. Nadia stared at him, at the man who had slept outside her door at a Borderlands inn, who had bought her dried meat without question, who had held her hand by firelight and promised to earn her trust. "You never said." The accusation emerged before she could stop it. "All this time, you let me believe that I was no one." Brennan's jaw tightened. "Because that's how I needed you to see me. Not as the king. Not as someone you might trust for power rather than—" He broke off, running a hand through his dark hair. "I needed to know you saw me, Nadia. Just me." A tremor ran through her that had nothing to do with the cold. Her wolf pressed forward, recognizing the truth in his words even as her mind reeled from the revelation. "The summit," she said slowly. "All 5 packs will be here." "Yes." "Including Ravencrest." His expression hardened. "Yes." Before she could respond, a horn sounded from the fortress walls, the announcement of arriving delegates. And Nadia watched in frozen horror as Wulfric's banner crested the ridge, her brother riding at the head of a Ravencrest delegation with a smile that promised nothing but ruin. The great hall blazed with torchlight and wolf presence. Representatives from all 5 packs had gathered for the summit's opening feast, their combined power pressing against Nadia's senses until her temples throbbed. She sat at Brennan's right hand, a position of honor that had sent whispers rippling through the assembled wolves like wind through winter grass. The disgraced exile at the High King's table, his mate, if the rumors were true, carrying a child whose true parentage had become the subject of vicious speculation. Wulfric had positioned himself among the Ravencrest delegation, close enough that she felt his gaze like a blade against her skin. He'd spent the past 3 days building alliances, she knew, whispering poison into the ears of council members, spreading his carefully constructed lies about stolen treasures and enemy conspiracies. But tonight, something felt different. A tension coiled beneath the false civility, sharp-edged and dangerous. Her healing senses prickled. Nadia watched a servant approach the high table with a goblet of wine, and her wolf stirred with sudden alarm. Not a warning about threat to herself. Something else. Something that tasted wrong in the air, that left an acrid residue against her heightened awareness. The servant placed the goblet before Brennan, and Nadia's gift, the same ability that let her sense illness in a body, detect harm before it manifested, screamed a warning so loud she felt it in her bones. Poison. She didn't think, didn't calculate the consequences or weigh the risks. Her hand shot out and knocked the goblet from Brennan's grip before it could reach his lips, sending wine splashing across the table in a dark red arc. Silence crashed over the hall. "Nadia?" Brennan's voice was sharp with confusion. "What?" "Don't drink it." She was standing now, though she didn't remember rising. Her voice carried through the sudden quiet, ringing against stone walls. "It's poisoned." The hall erupted. Wolves surged to their feet, hands going to weapons, voices shouting accusations and denials. But Nadia's eyes had found Wulfric across the chaos, and the flash of fury in his expression told her everything she needed to know. He'd expected Brennan to die tonight, expected the summit to dissolve into war, and she had just destroyed his plan. "You lying witch!" Wulfric's snarl cut through the noise, and the crowd parted as he strode forward. "First you steal from your own pack, then you spread slander against your family. Now you accuse innocent servants of assassination?" He turned to the assembled alphas, spreading his hands in a gesture of wounded innocence. "This is what exile does to the weak-minded. She'll say anything to gain the king's protection, spin any tale to justify her presence at his table." The words hit their target. Nadia saw doubt flicker across the faces of the gathered wolves, saw them weighing Wulfric's charm against her desperation. No one believed the disgraced exile. No one ever had. But something had changed inside her since that day in Thornhaven Market. She had been running for so long, from her brother, from the accusations, from the terrible certainty that she was alone in the world. And now she stood in the High King's hall with his bond humming through her blood, and she was done running. "Test it." Her voice came out steady, stronger than she'd expected. "If I'm lying, the wine will be harmless. But if I'm telling the truth, by all means." Wulfric's smile turned sharp. "Let's test it. On the servant who carried it, since my sister seems so eager to condemn innocent wolves." The servant, a young male barely past his coming of age, had gone pale with terror. Nadia saw him glance toward Wulfric, saw the desperate plea in his eyes, and something clicked into place. This was the wolf Wulfric had bribed, the one who knew the truth. She stepped forward, and her wolf lent her its certainty as she spoke directly to the terrified servant. "He promised you something, didn't he? Protection for your family, maybe. Or threatened them with harm if you didn't obey." The young wolf's eyes went wide, and she pressed on with the gentle firmness that had once made her Ravencrest's most trusted healer. "I was a healer before I was in exile. I know fear when I see it. And I know you're not a killer. You're someone who made a terrible choice because you thought you had no other options." "Don't listen to her." Wulfric's composure cracked, just slightly. "She's manipulating you, trying to—" "I'm offering you the truth." Nadia kept her attention on the servant, letting her sincerity carry through her voice. "Whatever he threatened, whatever he promised, it doesn't have to end like this. The High King's justice is fair. If you speak honestly about what happened, about who ordered this, you won't face punishment meant for another's crime." The servant's breath shuddered. His eyes darted between Nadia and Wulfric, and she could see the battle playing out across his features. Fear warring with exhaustion, lies crumbling against the weight of what he carried. "I invoke trial by testimony." Nadia turned to face the assembled alphas, drawing on ancient laws she'd studied in her years as a healer. Under the old traditions, any accused may call witnesses to speak for or against them. I call this wolf to testify about the true source of tonight's poisoning. The hall went utterly still. Then the servant crumpled to his knees and began to talk. The truth poured out in halting, terrified sentences. How Wulfric had approached him weeks ago with threats against his mother and sisters. How he'd been given the poison with explicit instructions about which goblet, which moment, which victim. How Wulfric had boasted of his plans to seize control of Ravencrest by eliminating the High King and blaming it on his exiled sister. By the time he finished, Wulfric's mask had shattered completely. Lies. The word came out as a snarl. All of it, lies conjured by a bitter traitor who couldn't accept her rightful punishment. He rounded on Nadia with fury blazing in his eyes. You were always too soft to survive, little sister. Too weak. Too trusting. Our father knew it. That's why he never trained you for anything but tending wounds while I learned to lead. Father loved me. The certainty of it rang through her voice. You couldn't stand that. Couldn't stand that his healer daughter mattered as much to him as his warrior son. He's dead because of you. Wulfric's control finally broke entirely. You should have sensed the danger, should have warned him, but you were too busy playing at medicines to actually protect anyone. I was 16 years old. Nadia's voice cracked on the admission, but she didn't look away. I was young, and my gifts hadn't fully manifested, and I couldn't save him. I've carried that guilt for years, let you twist it into a weapon against me, but I survived, Wulfric. She straightened, and her wolf rose with her, lending her its ancient strength. I survived your lies. I survived exile. I survived you. And that was enough. Wulfric lunged. The concealed blade flashed in the torchlight, aimed directly at her belly, at the child he'd claimed to want for his own twisted purposes. But the truth was written in his eyes now. He didn't want her baby as an heir. He wanted to destroy everything she loved, everything she might become. Brennan moved faster than any wolf Nadia had ever seen, intercepting Wulfric's strike and driving him backward with a force that cracked the stone floor beneath their feet. The blade clattered away into the darkness, and Brennan's hand closed around Wulfric's throat, golden eyes blazing with the fury of his wolf barely contained. Give me one reason, Brennan snarled, why I shouldn't tear out your throat where you stand. The 5 alphas had risen from their seats. Their voices overlapped in judgment, condemnation, pronouncements of guilt. But it was the eldest among them, a silver-haired female whose pack had held these mountains since before written histories began, who spoke the final words. Wulfric of Ravencrest, you stand convicted of attempted regicide, false accusation against your blood kin, and conspiracy against the peace of the 5 packs. Her voice rang with ancient authority. The sentence is exile to the Dead Lands, where no pack will shelter you and no wolf will speak your name. Guards seized Wulfric from Brennan's grip. As they dragged him toward the doors, he twisted against their hold, his face contorted with hatred. This isn't over! His scream echoed off the stone walls. Nadia! Nadia! But she didn't flinch, didn't cower, didn't give him the fear he'd fed on for so long. She simply stood with her hand on her belly and watched her monster disappear into the darkness where he belonged. Later, after the hall had emptied and the summit had been suspended until morning, and the weight of everything that had happened settled into her bones, Nadia found herself in Brennan's chambers with the door closed against the world. She was trembling, she realized. Not from fear, from release. Years of terror and guilt and desperate survival finally loosening their grip on her heart. You stood against him. Brennan's voice was rough as he crossed to where she stood by the fire. In front of 5 packs, with everything to lose, you faced him, and you won. I couldn't let him hurt anyone else. Her voice caught. Couldn't let him take my child and twist them into something like himself. Our child. The words hung between them, and Nadia looked up to find Brennan watching her with an expression that made her breath falter. His eyes had gone soft around the edges, gold flickering in their depths like banked embers waiting to ignite. Brennan. I know it's not mine by blood. He moved closer, and the warmth of his presence wrapped around her like a physical thing. But if you'll let me, I want to be its father. I want to raise it with you. Protect it. Love it as fiercely as I. His voice broke, and he had to start again. As fiercely as I love you. Her wolf keened inside her chest. The bond between them blazed so bright she could almost see it, a golden thread connecting her heart to his. I don't know if I can give you what you deserve, she whispered. I'm still broken in so many ways. Then we'll be broken together. He raised his hand, slow and careful, giving her every chance to pull away. When she didn't, his palm cupped her cheek with devastating gentleness. And maybe, in time, we'll heal each other. Nadia leaned into his touch. Her wolf settled deeper into the rightness of this moment, this man, this impossible gift she'd never expected to receive. I want... The words tangled in her throat. She'd spent so long denying herself, protecting herself. But Brennan had earned her trust, one careful gesture at a time. I want you to mark me. I want to be yours. Something raw and desperate moved through his expression. You're certain? Yes. He drew her closer, and the last of her walls crumbled to dust, his arms wrapped around her with exquisite care for her swollen belly, his forehead pressing against hers while their wolves sang recognition into the space between them. Tell me if anything hurts. His voice had dropped to a rough whisper. Tell me if you need to stop. I won't need to stop. He kissed her then, soft and reverent, like she was something sacred he'd been entrusted to protect. Nadia melted into the warmth of his body, feeling the rightness of it settle into her bones. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Brennan guided her to sit on the edge of his bed. He knelt before her, his hands bracketing her hips, his golden eyes blazing with an intensity that made her shiver. The marking, he said, voice hoarse. It will hurt at first, and then... I know what it will feel like. She threaded her fingers through his dark hair, marveling at the softness of it. I've heard the stories. Stories don't capture it. He turned his head, pressing his lips to her palm. Nothing captures it. Then he was rising, guiding her back against the pillows, positioning himself beside her with care that made her heart ache. His hand cradled the back of her head as he tilted her face, exposing the vulnerable curve where her neck met her shoulder. Mine, he breathed against her skin, and sank his teeth into her flesh. Pain blazed through her, sharp and sudden and utterly consuming. Nadia gasped, her hands fisting in his shirt, her wolf howling inside her chest. But even as the pain crested, something else was building beneath it. A wave of heat that started where his mouth claimed her and spread through her veins like wildfire, transforming agony into something that defied description. The bond between them ripped open. Everything Brennan was poured into her, his devotion, his desperate longing, his iron-willed determination to protect her at any cost. She felt centuries of isolation dissolving, felt his wolf reaching for hers with a need so profound it brought tears to her eyes. He released the bite slowly, his tongue tracing the mark he'd left, and Nadia heard herself whimper at the overwhelming rush of sensation. Yours, he murmured against her throat, forever. But it wasn't complete. Not yet. Nadia reached up, cupping his jaw, urging him down until she could press her lips to the junction of his neck and shoulder. He shuddered against her, and she felt his pulse hammering beneath her mouth. My turn, she whispered. She bit down. His growl vibrated through her chest as her teeth broke skin, as his blood touched her tongue and the bond blazed brighter than anything she'd ever experienced. His hand spasmed against her hip, his entire body going rigid with the force of what was happening between them. Nadia felt herself pouring through the newly opened connection, her resilience, her capacity for healing, her stubborn determination to survive, and she felt him receiving it, felt his wolf rising to meet hers in a joining that transcended the physical. When she released the bite, they were both trembling. Mine. She breathed against his marked skin. Yours. His voice cracked on the word. Mate. They held each other as the aftershocks rolled through them, as the bond settled into something golden and warm and unbreakable. Nadia pressed her face against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, steady and strong, matching the rhythm of her own. I never thought I'd have this, she admitted quietly. After everything Wulfric did, after the exile, I thought I was going to die alone in those borderlands. I found you. Brennan's arms tightened around her. My wolf led me to Thornhaven on a route I never take, made me stop at a market stall I had no reason to visit. And there you were. He pressed a kiss to her hair. I think we were always meant to find each other, Nadia. I think the bond knew, even before we did. She tilted her face up to look at him, and his hand rose to trace the fresh mark on her neck. His claim, permanent and undeniable. I love you, she said, and the truth of it rang through every syllable. I didn't think I could. Didn't think I had room left for anything but fear. But you, I know. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, the corner of her mouth. I love you too. Both of you. His hand settled on her belly, and their daughter kicked against his palm as if in response. The coronation took place on the first day of spring, when the mountain snows had begun to melt, and the world was waking toward warmth again. Nadia stood in the great hall wearing a gown of silver and gold, her mate mark visible above the neckline, her daughter cradled in her arms. The baby had arrived 2 weeks earlier, strong and healthy, with her mother's dark eyes and a howl that had echoed through the fortress at her first breath. They'd named her Aurora for the way she'd entered the world just as dawn painted the sky in shades of hope. The 5 alphas had gathered once more, but this time the atmosphere held no tension, no undercurrents of political maneuvering. They had witnessed what Nadia was capable of. Her courage, her honesty, her willingness to stand against injustice even when everything seemed lost. And they had recognized what their High King had found in her. Nadia, formerly of Ravencrest. The silver-haired Alpha's voice carried through the silent hall. The High King has chosen you as his mate and Luna Queen. Do you accept this bond, with all its responsibilities and honors? I accept. Nadia's voice rang clear and strong. I pledge to serve the 5 packs with wisdom and compassion, to protect those who cannot protect themselves, and to stand always at my mate's side. The crown settled onto her head, delicate silver worked into the shapes of mountain wolves, and Brennan took her hand as they turned to face their people together. The hall erupted in howls of recognition. 5 packs, united in their celebration, welcoming their new Luna Queen with voices that shook the ancient stone walls. Later, when the ceremony had ended and the feasting had begun, a Ravencrest messenger approached the high table with nervous deference. Nadia recognized the symbols on his cloak, felt her chest tighten with old pain. Luna, Queen. He bowed low. I carry words from the Ravencrest elders. They wish to... He swallowed. They wish to apologize. For what was done to you. For believing the lies. Nadia looked at him for a long moment, the part of her that remembered exile, remembered starvation and fear and her mother's eyes sliding away. That part wanted to reject the apology, to return cruelty for cruelty. But she wasn't that desperate broken wolf anymore. Tell them I have received their words, she said quietly. And tell them, I have found my home now. I wish them peace. The messenger departed, and Brennan's hand found hers beneath the table. You didn't have to be gracious, he murmured. I know. She leaned into his warmth, watching their daughter sleep in the arms of a trusted nursemaid nearby. But holding on to bitterness would only poison what we're building. I want Aurora to grow up knowing that mercy is stronger than vengeance. Brennan lifted her hand to his lips. You constantly amaze me. Good. She smiled at him. A real smile, unguarded and full. I'd hate to become predictable. That night, they stood together on the fortress balcony, watching stars emerge over the mountains that were now their kingdom. Aurora slept peacefully in her cradle nearby, and the bond between Nadia and Brennan hummed with contentment so profound it felt like coming home. I was dying when you found me, Nadia said softly. Not just starving, dying inside. Everything Wulfric took from me. My pack, my family, my belief in myself. I thought there was nothing left. And now? She turned to face him, this impossible man who had given her everything simply by seeing her clearly, by refusing to let her disappear. Now I have more than I ever dreamed possible. She reached up to trace the mark on his neck, her claim, her promise, her forever. A mate who chose me before he knew my name, a daughter who carries the best of both of us, a home that will never cast me out. Brennan caught her hand and pressed it flat against his chest, over his beating heart. This belongs to you, he said. It has since the moment I saw you in that market, starving and defiant, and so beautiful it hurt to look at you. I didn't know who you were, or what you'd been through. I only knew, his voice roughened with emotion. I only knew I would burn down the world to keep you safe. Nadia rose on her toes and kissed him. Slow and tender, a promise for all the years stretching ahead of them. When they finally pulled apart, she tucked herself against his side and watched the stars wheel overhead. Somewhere out there, in the dead lands where no pack would shelter him, Wulfric faced the exile he'd once inflicted on her. The cruelty he'd sown had finally come home. But Nadia didn't think about him anymore. She thought about her daughter's soft breathing, and her mate's steady heartbeat, and the kingdom that had accepted a disgraced exile as its queen. She thought about survival becoming hope, and hope becoming love, and love becoming everything she'd never dared to want. And as Brennan's arm tightened around her, as the bond between them settled deeper into her bones, Nadia of the Five Pack smiled at the starlit sky and let herself believe in happy endings at last.